The market fell silent when the little prince tugged at his father's hand and cried, "Daddy, that beggar woman looks just like Mom." The widowed prince froze, his gaze locking on the ragged figure sprawled against the stones, her face a haunting mirror of the princess he had buried. Around them, merchants bowed hastily, while the Dowager Queen's envoy sneered, ordering the guards to drag the filthy impostor away. Yet even in rags, with bruised hands clutching a tattered shawl, the woman's eyes carried a dignity that pierced the prince's soul. And as the crowd held its breath, none could guess the truth that would shatter the kingdom and rewrite its bloodline. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The market woke like a living thing, a great breath drawn through winding lanes and timbered stalls, the hum rising with the sun. Wagon wheels rattled over cobbles slick with yesterday's rain. Bakers cracked open their ovens and sent out warm loaves with crusts that sang as they cooled. Cloth merchants flung bolts of wool and linen over their arms, the colors catching the light like banners. Farriers hammered shoe to hoof, the ring of iron crisp as a bell. On such mornings, the city behaved as though each hand knew its task, and each voice knew its place, and order, for a blessed hour, seemed possible. Prince Alistair kept to the edge of the throng, a slim path forming and closing around him as he passed. The guards held formation with the quiet precision of habit, their boots scuffing in unison, their eyes sweeping the crowd in practiced arcs. He wore a dark coat and gloves against the damp, not ostentatious, and the people bowed more with their eyes than their bodies, as if to nod at a man rather than a symbol. He inclined his head in return out of respect rather than expectation. Once each month he came to this place, not as spectacle, but as witness. He asked nothing that morning but to walk and to see. Edmund matched his father's stride for a dozen steps before curiosity shattered discipline. The boy was 7, curious in the way that made every thin dog a friend, every broken crate a prize. He craned to watch a bird seller lift a cage cover, gasped softly at the sudden shimmer of wings. He stared as a taffy maker pulled sugar into a shining ribbon, and then, fascinated and solemn, turned to the old woman roasting chestnuts and counted each one turned on the blade. Alistair noticed. He always noticed. He said, low enough for only the boy and the nearest guard to hear, "Stay near, Edmund." The boy nodded, solemn for a heartbeat, before the next gleam tugged him away. The first tug on Alistair's chest came, as ever, uninvited. A whiff of soap from a washer's line, the same scent his wife had loved. A particular laugh with a crack at the end, once made in his own houses. A shawl tied just so. Memory made the market treacherous. He felt it and did not try to banish it. There are ghosts that hurt less when you acknowledge them. They turned into a narrower lane, one that dipped away from the main road and held more shadow than sun. The stalls here were poorer. Repairs had been made with string where elsewhere there would be fresh nails. Alistair saw it as a ledger in motion, thin purses, careful hands, the math of survival. A little girl ran past with a loaf clutched to her chest and a grin that owed nothing to coin. Edmund watched her go, puzzled and delighted in the same breath. A drummer in the corner tapped an unsteady rhythm on an upturned bucket to draw attention to his uncle's apples. It was the part of the market Alistair returned to in his thoughts when court dinners ran long and talk turned to nothing that mattered. Then the boy stopped. He did not stumble or slow. He stopped, so completely the guard behind him nearly walked into him. Edmund's hand rose, small and sure, pointing down the side of the lane where the shadow deepened. Alistair saw the shape first, a figure drawn into itself, as if to become smaller than the space it occupied. Rags lay around it with the collapsed look of cloth that had lost the habit of warmth. A single strand of hair had escaped whatever knot had been attempted and lay like a thread of dark ink across a pale cheek. "Daddy, that woman living on the street looks just like Mom." The words landed with the lightness of a child and the weight of a verdict. Even in the noise, the nearest vendors fell quiet, not because they had heard the words, but because something in the air shifted. Alistair turned his head, detail sharpening as his breath caught. He stepped once, twice toward the shadow. The guards moved with him, a ripple around the prince, but he lifted a hand, and they kept a respectful distance. He saw her face. The world narrowed to that. The rest of the market receded until it seemed a painting hung at the back of a long corridor. That face, features arranged in a pattern that his bones knew. The arch of the brow, the line of the cheek, the tilt of the mouth at rest. Almost a question. His chest tightened as though a fist had closed around his ribs. He knew which memories to distrust, knew how grief could carve away the real and leave only the ideal. He searched for the flaw that would break the likeness, something too sharp in the jaw, a different shade to the eyes. There were differences. There always are. Life had marked this woman in a language inked in hardship, hunger around the mouth, sleep in snatches written in bruised shadows beneath the eyes. But the resemblance was not a trick of the mind. It was there, plain as a ring on a finger. "Your Highness?" The captain of the guard kept his voice low. Alistair heard him as if through fog. He took another step. The woman flinched. She lifted her head a fraction, not enough to challenge, only enough to insist she existed. Edmund made a sound, half inhalation, the beginning of a name he did not understand how to give. "Stay with me," Alistair said to his son without looking away. He took off his glove, then thought better of it. He did not reach out. That would be a kind of touch he was not ready for. The woman turned her face away, hiding as a creature hides from a lantern. Pride sat strangely on rags, but it was there. Alistair felt the old ache sharpen into something else, a line from the heart to the hand, an urge to shield. He had not expected that. He had expected the empty ache. He glanced at the crowd. Heads were turning one by one, attention attaching like burrs to wool. He could hear snippets. He could always hear the wrong ones. A trick. A sign. The dead are never far. Alistair found himself wanting quiet. He wanted a room with a door and the chance to speak and to hear without rumors' hands on everything. Impossible here. Stillness is a luxury in a market. He lifted his chin and motioned the captain closer. "Gently," he said. The captain nodded and gestured to two men, who approached slowly, palms open as if to show they carried no harm. The woman watched them with the watchfulness of someone who has learned never to be surprised by what the world takes. Then, when one of the guards reached for her forearm to help her stand, she flinched back and smacked her palm against the cobblestone, trying to push herself away from their reach. The movement cost her. Her breath went shallow. "It's all right," Alistair said, and only then realized he had said it aloud. He kept his voice level. He moved one step closer, close enough to see the uneven lay of her lashes. "You are not in trouble." The words felt inadequate and immediately childish. One does not undo years with a sentence. Her eyes flicked to his face. He saw the calculation there, the speed of it. Recognition of rank is not taught. It is absorbed the way one learns the weather. She swallowed and tried to sit up. She was not trying to appeal. She was trying to gather what had fallen from her piece by piece, her dignity first, then the rest. A baker's boy, emboldened by proximity, took a step forward for a better look, and his mother's hand snatched him back. Those small movements goad larger ones. People edged nearer, curiosity pressing, like a tide against a rock. Alistair felt the thin boundary between seeing and gawking stretch thin. "Back," the captain said, firm but not unkind. He gestured, and the guards widened their stance to form a more generous circle. The woman's shoulders lowered by a fraction with the space, but her chin stayed tucked. She coughed, a dry sound of a well long empty. "Bring a cloak," Alistair said to the nearest guard, "and water." A runner darted toward the nearest stall and returned with a woolen piece that smelled faintly of sheep and smoke, along with a wooden ladle and a bucket drawn from a barrel. The guard knelt, slow as dawn, and held the ladle near the woman's lips. She hesitated, then accepted, the water shaking a little as she drank. It soaked into her like thanks she wouldn't give voice to. "Your Highness," the captain pressed again, the question now heavy with implication. The street had come to a halt. Too long here, and whispers would outpace him home. He looked at Edmund. The boy's eyes were fixed on the woman and did not look away when she turned her face again. Alistair's decision opened inside him like a door he had always known was there. He did not interrogate the ethics of it. Those would come, and he would face them. For now there was sense, and there was instinct, and there was a human being on the ground in the midst of it. "To the palace," he said. The captain's breath piped in, barely audible. "Not to the prisons," Alistair added, voice cool as at council. "She is to be housed." He felt the weight of each word settle onto his shoulders. "And no harm is to come to her on the way." The market murmured as a living thing murmurs, a ripple that becomes a wave. Some crossed themselves, some craned, some whispered names. The child prince, his father's son, looked up and nodded as if a promise had been given he could not yet define. The woman closed her eyes, some calculation finished behind those lids. She did not speak. She seemed to fold her resistance up and set it aside, obsessive neatness in the face of power. The guards moved, not rough but efficient. One slid the cloak around her, not touching her skin more than necessary. Another helped lift her under the elbow as she found her feet. Then her legs betrayed her, and she sagged. A third stepped in, and with a careful scoop, raised her as one lifts a bundle that happens to breathe. Alistair nodded once, and the formation adjusted. The captain placed himself at the head of the column. Alistair took his boy's hand. They turned as one toward the way they had come. The movement drew eyes from blocks away. The path remade itself under the pressure of ceremony. The smell of fish from the morning's catch drifted out to meet them. The sun made a thin attempt to break the cloud, gilding the edges of shutters and the tips of the church's iron fence. A dog barked and then stopped, sensing the current and deciding not to step into it. The drummer put down his sticks. A man mending a net rose with the needle still in his hand. There is a silence that arises not from lack of sound, but from agreement that something is not ordinary. "Father," Edmund said, so low that only Alistair felt the breath of it. The prince squeezed the boy's fingers and kept his eyes forward. One does not teach a child to be brave by denying his fear. One teaches it by walking through it. They passed the jetty where the river lapped at the stone in slow, patient strokes. A woman in a green shawl pressed herself and her basket to the wall to make room. The guard with the woman in his arms adjusted his hold without jostling her. She had grown very still, the kind of stillness that conserves heat. Alistair glanced at her face. The resemblance in rest was sharper, a trick of angle. He forced himself to accept the trick and not to pursue it, the way one ignores a wine's scent to keep from indulgence. "Your Highness," a man called, not too loud, a habit of respect more than fear. Alistair did not turn. He set the cadence with his stride, not too fast, not too slow, so that the escort did not become a spectacle of haste or a parade. Dignity was his ally now. Dignity was a cloak to wrap around the woman as much as the wool was. A thin drizzle began to fall, the sort that in summer would be welcomed and in spring is tolerated. The coat kept it off Alistair's shoulders. The cloak did the same for the woman. The city made its accommodations for weather with the same blunt pragmatism it made for power. He could taste damp stone. He could count in his head the steps between turns. He had counted them with his wife years before, on evenings when the market was shut and the streets became avenues for talking. They came at last to the open square that gave onto the palace road. The building rose not distant, but near enough that you could see the workers on the roof, small as moving fence posts, adjusting a loose tile. The gates, when they were shut, were not the sort to make a man think he could batter them down, not the sort to make a man think of battering at all. They were heavy with iron, but not snarling with spikes. Alistair had never liked the spikes. His father had. Alistair had the spikes removed. The guard with the woman shifted again. She stirred, her eyes flicking open to take in the height of the walls that would receive her. She wet her lips, then pressed them together. Alistair walked at her side and said, because it seemed to be required, "You will be warm there." He felt foolish as soon as he spoke. Comfort given late is always suspect. Still, she looked at him and did not look away. It was not gratitude he saw. It was something like acceptance, laced with a thin line of contempt, perhaps for the world more than for him. "Sir," the captain murmured, closer than before. He had seen the same look. He had learned to read faces not for sentiment, but for threat. Alistair kept his own expression composed. It was remarkable what a composed face can do. At the edge of the square, an old man stepped half a shoe width into their path, and then thought better of it. He pulled his cap off and twisted it once in his hands. A woman pulled him back, and he let himself be pulled. Alistair nodded to him. Small courtesies hold the line when larger ones are impossible. They reached the road. The escort arranged itself for the slight incline. A cart came rattling from the other direction and veered clumsily aside, the driver's mouth forming apologies that didn't quite become sound. The horse snorted and stamped, then calmed. Edmund stayed very close to his father now, his earlier boldness banked. He darted a glance at the woman and then, the way boys do when they feel the gravity of a moment and can find no purchase on it, looked at the prince's hand, and the ring there, and then the veins, and then the way the glove creased at the knuckle. The ordinary, again, to save himself. Halfway up the incline, a gust of wind came down off the hill and lifted the edges of the woman's cloak. One corner of ragged hem flapped free and slapped against the guard's sleeve before settling. The little sound was nothing and yet strangely loud. The woman, in the guard's hold, set her jaw and breathed through the movement. Her fingers, visible at the cloak's edge, tightened once on the wool and then let go. She was disciplining her hands. Alistair saw it and felt a complicated respect. Dignity persists in odd places. "Almost there," the captain called to his men, in the tone of a man who counts distances because they are solvable problems. The rain deepened and then thinned, as rain does when it remembers itself. The palace gates stood open. They were rarely closed in daylight. Shutting them sent a message Alistair preferred not to send unless necessary. In the archway, one could see the courtyard beyond, the flagstones scrupulously swept, the line of steps ascending to the main door. A stable boy ran from one side to the other with a bridle over his shoulder and eyes round as pennies at the procession. One of the kitchen maids, sent to fetch herbs from a cart, stood frozen with a sprig of thyme in her hand and a sprig of fear in her eye. She stepped aside quickly and dropped a quick nod as Alistair met her gaze and then looked away to spare her embarrassment. The woman in the guard's arms turned her head to watch the gates. Her breath hitched. One does not always read breath right. Sometimes it is simply a body doing what it must. This hitch, though, felt like a thought becoming physical. Alistair wondered what she expected, and then scolded himself for wondering as though he were an observer, and not the man making the choice that would shape her next hour. He wished, absurdly, for tea and a table. He wished for the simple, for the civil, for the middle ground, where inquiry is not interrogation. None of that existed between the market and the palace gates. They passed under the arch. The air there smelled different, as if the stone itself had a scent distinct from the city just beyond. Cooler, a little older. Alistair's ears caught the change in sound, the way the rain on stone shifts pitch when there is a roof over part of it. He lifted his chin and let the change happen. He did not look back to see how many had followed to the threshold. Whatever came of this would be discussed within these walls. There are places where the world is invited to weigh in on a man's life. His home was not one of them. As they stepped from shadow into the courtyard, Edmund's hand tightened once more and then loosened. The guards adjusted. The formation compressed slightly to move up the steps. The woman closed her eyes. The captain glanced back for the final instruction, and Alistair gave it with a nod, as small as the distance between two heartbeats. The beggar woman, barely conscious, was carried into the shadow of the royal palace as the market behind them broke into whispers of ghosts and scandal. The guards crossed the courtyard with their burden as if carrying a secret they did not wish to know too much about. The rain softened to a mist that clung to hair and eyelashes, and in the quiet hum beneath the eaves, the world felt smaller than the market had been. The main doors opened with a patient groan. Warmth, layered with the faint scent of beeswax and ash, touched the woman's cheeks. She kept her eyes open now, not trusting the darkness behind her lids, counting breaths and doorways as if either could be made to add up to safety. She was set down on a narrow bed in a chamber off a side corridor, the door closing most of the noise behind it. The room had a working fire, no more than a modest eye of flame, coals pulsing like sleeping embers. A small brass basin sat on a table near the window. The panes were flawed, the glass warped just enough to smudge the shapes beyond. She measured the distance to that window as the guards adjusted their stance in the doorway. "Rest," said one, not unkindly. He set a folded blanket at the foot of the bed and withdrew a hand as if it might prove rude to leave it there any longer. The other placed a wooden cup on the table and stepped back to take his station. Their armor made soft sounds when they breathed. The woman considered the taste of water left sitting and decided she could bear it. A maid came, young, with careful hands. She carried a ewer that steamed. The woman watched the way the maid's sleeve dragged at her wrist, threads pulling where a button should have been. Care is always uneven in a big house. The maid poured the hot water into the basin and left the rest of the pitcher near the hearth. "You may wash," she said, and then, because the words alone sounded too cold, added softly, "if you wish." Her eyes rose without permission to the woman's face, then darted down again. "The fire will hold. I will bring bread." "Thank you," the woman answered, and the words scraped her throat. It startled her, the sound. She had not heard her own voice in a place like this. When the maid slipped out, the woman listened. Footsteps passed. Voices thinned as they moved farther down the hall. Somewhere, a clock answered the hour, measured and unadorned. She dipped her fingers into the basin and held them there until the heat moved into her bones. The dirt that came off her felt like a history falling in ribbons. It did not change who she was, but it made her feel less like a warning hung on a door. She lifted the cup and sipped. Water without grit can make a body weep. She set it down with practiced care, as if it were a thing that might be taken if it clattered. The blanket smelled faintly of soap. She counted the threads woven too loosely at the corner of the sheet. She knew how much these things cost. She could put a price to the firewood on smell alone. Her mind went back, despite order, to the boy's face, wide and guileless, to the prince's hand in the boy's hair without thinking, to the prince's eyes. Those were the danger. People look at you all the time when you live outside. They look and then they look away, and neither matters. He had looked with recognition and with restraint. A person with power who knows the cost of using it is the sharpest blade in the kitchen. Her gaze snagged on the window again. The latch was simple, older than the paint on the frame. The drop, if there was one, would not be far. But she had been carried up a step, and then another. She rubbed her palms on the blanket and felt the grit she had not managed to wash away. It steadied her. The maid returned with a trencher of bread and a heel of cheese and set it on the table. "Eat," she said, eyes hesitant again. "Please." The woman tore a small piece and waited a beat as if to see whether the room would object. It did not. She ate slowly, each mouthful argued through. The maid stood half in, half out of the doorway, as if there were instructions on both sides. "They say," the maid began, and then swallowed the rest of the sentence. "I am to bring more wood in an hour." "Thank you," the woman said again. The maid nodded and went, relief in the way her shoulders fell. Left alone, the woman leaned back against the headboard and listened to the fire behave itself. Every shift of coal had the courtesy to be known in advance. She curled her fingers into the blanket and tried not to think of mirrors she had avoided for years and faces that followed even where there were no mirrors. The prince's gaze returned despite her best efforts to send it away. If she had been a little stronger, a little better fed, she might have asked him for the rules. Rules make poverty livable. Rule 1, keep moving. Rule 2, keep quiet. Rule 3, when power is kind, decide quickly what to do with the kindness before it decides for you. The guards outside murmured to one another. She could not make out the words, only the cadence. Left foot, right foot, weight shifted at the same spots in the floorboards. She measured them subconsciously, a map forming of sounds and spaces. She noticed the latch on the door was the sort that could be drawn quietly, but only from the outside. She tried not to let her breath get too fast at that. She made it slow again, and it made her stomach hurt. She washed her hands once more and pushed wet hair back from her brow, smoothing it through there was no one to see. The basin clouded with the past sliding off her. She set the cloth down neatly, as she would in a house that wanted her there. It is a foolish habit. It keeps a soul alive. Footsteps heavier than the guards came to a stop on the other side of the door. The woman stiffened. The latch lifted. A man in livery peered in, eyes flicking about the chamber like a sparrow. "His Highness asks if you have all you require," he said, speaking of the prince as of a duty, not a person. He did not step fully into the room. "And if you are unwell, a message can be sent." "I require nothing," she said, and felt the lie as one feels a stone in a boot. "Tell him that." She lifted her chin, a small movement, old habit worn like a rag that still resembled a garment. The servant's gaze softened a degree. He bowed, a precise angle, and withdrew. The guard's boots adjusted again to standing at attention. The woman stared at the door and wondered if the prince would come himself, and then told herself sternly that it did not matter, that nothing mattered but the next breath, and the one after, and the keeping of them her own. She finished the slice of bread and let the last crumbs dissolve on her tongue. She moved her feet under the blanket to find warmth that did not exist and pulled the cloak nearer. She lay back not to sleep, but to make her body less interesting to watch. Through the window, the day's light shifted slowly against the warped glass, and she watched it, not because it was beautiful, but because it did not demand anything from her. In the corridor, a whisper traveled with purpose. It moved faster than footsteps. Those who wore aprons heard it first. Those who wore keys on chains heard it next. It ran up the back stairs like a child and slipped into a door the size of a hand, the Dowager Queen's women being told, so that the Dowager might be told, that something had been brought into the house which should not have been, and that it had a face that refused to be ignored. Across the hall, Prince Alistair wiped rain from his cuffs with an economy of motion that looked like neatness, and was in fact nerves. He did not like to think of himself as a man ruled by nerves, but the knowledge of who watched him and why had always made him precise. "Fire in the guest chamber?" he asked. "Yes, Your Highness." "And bread?" "Yes." His gaze went to the door across, then to the floorboards, as if the wood could tell him whether the woman had eaten, whether she had drunk, whether she would bolt like a startled deer given the smallest gap in the fence. He chastised himself for the thought. She was not an animal. The market had a way of making people into types that were easier to handle. "See that no one speaks to her without leave," he said to the captain. "No questions, no gawking." "Aye, Your Highness." The captain's mouth flattened. The household has ears. Some of them do not obey orders, only appetites. "Then you will show appetite for obedience," Alistair said, but leveled the rebuke with a near smile so it would hold better. The captain nodded and went to adjust the men at the door, not with barked names but with beds of the eyes and small gestures. Edmund stood with his nurse at the end of the corridor, the boy's fingers curled tight around the nurse's hand. He had the look of a child, determined not to ask for what he'd been told he could not have. Alistair raised a hand. The nurse bobbed a curtsy and guided the boy away. her own eyes curious beyond what she would indulge. Edmund looked back once, the set of his mouth stubborn in a way that reminded Alistair of a happier life. It burned and healed at once. A footman in the Dowager Queen's livery arrived, breath tight. He bowed deeply. "Your Highness, Her Majesty asks for you." Alistair let his shoulders settle into command. "Now?" "Her Majesty is in her parlour, sir." "Of course she is," Alistair murmured, half to himself, then to the captain. "Hold the hall." He cast one more glance at the door to the woman's chamber. He did not give an order for the physician. He did not know whether kindness would help or harm. He pushed down the heavy thought that everything was harm when done under watch. He crossed the lesser stair and took the corridor that led to the Dowager Queen's rooms. Portraits lined the walls, oil faces that tracked a man as he moved with the silent judgment of those who no longer had to live with their choices. He had asked to have a few of them moved years earlier. He had been permitted to move none. The door to the parlor stood open enough to indicate command disguised as invitation. He paused at the threshold and bowed. The Dowager Queen sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, a silk shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, though the fire gave off sufficient heat. Age had narrowed her frame without reducing her presence. Her hair, once iron, now was white, not softening her features but sharpening them. A pair of attendants stood against the wall with the stillness of furniture. The air carried the faint, tight scent of lavender, not flowers, but linen. "Mother," Alistair said, lifting from his bow only as far as courtesy allowed without seeming too quick. "You sent for me." She did not extend a hand. She did not need props to enforce her place. "I did," she said. "Sit." She glanced not at the chair he chose, but at the space he left between himself and her hearth. He had been measured and had either passed or failed. She would tell him which in a moment. He sat. He did not choose a soft chair. He still carried the damp in his cuffs and did not want to mark her upholstery. It was not about the furniture. It was about offending nothing unnecessary so that what must be confronted could be confronted without distraction. "There is a story walking through my house," she said after a quiet stretch in which the only sound was the clock's restrained insistence. "And it has your hand on its shoulder." "There is a woman resting in a room," he replied. He kept his tone even. If he spoke too gently, she would call it weakness, too stiffly, and she would call it stubbornness. She was unwell. I could not leave her in the street. Her mouth moved in a way that in other faces would be called a smile, and in hers could be called a shifting of knives. "A prince is a servant of his people," she said. "He is not their rescuer. The one who tries to be both becomes neither." She resembled... He stopped, the word reluctant to be spoken aloud. His mother did not look at him when he stopped. She looked over his shoulder at the portrait of his father above the mantel. "Resemblance," she said, "is the cheapest currency in a city. It buys gossip. It purchases a crowd." She turned back to him. "You carried gossip through my gates on a cushion." "She resembled," he said again, and now it was a statement, not an attempt to persuade. Enough that the market would not have let me pass. Enough that my son spoke. He let the truth sit between them without decoration. The dowager's fingers tightened on the shawl a fraction. "Then you ought to have taken a different street, or covered her with a different cloth," he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice and deciding, for once, not to try. "And in so doing told my son we hide what confuses us." "Do not make a lesson out of a mistake," she said, and her voice cooled. "You have brought into this palace a woman whose face will be used against us by anyone who finds use in it. You have given impudence a bed. Today it is a street woman. Tomorrow it is a man with a petition he says is righteous because his mother bore a scar in the shape of our crest. We can put her out again," he said, and it wrenched him to hear the words even as he said them. He felt the insult of them on his own tongue. "If that is required." She leaned in, her gaze sharp, pleased to see something of herself in him at last. "Can you?" It was not a question. "Will you?" Silence hung with weight. He could hear the coal shift in the grate and thought of the woman in the guest chamber listening to her own fire and judging the rhythm of feet outside her door. He exhaled slowly. I will do what is required to keep this house from breaking under rumor. I do not yet know what that is. That is because you have let sentiment throw a veil over duty. She rose, and the attendants moved not at all. They were trained to act always a beat slower than her. I spoke to the chamberlain. I know where she lies. She is to be removed. Removed where? He said softly. His breath shortened slightly, and he let the question be a contained thing rather than a rising wave. Her eyes flickered at the levity she heard and did not relish. Away, she said. Out. You should not need me to say the word. Have her sent back to the street. If you fear that will draw eyes, give her a coin and a cloak and see that she walks. It will be mercy enough. He thought of the market again, of the bowing of heads as his men had passed, of the thin rain and the way the woman had tightened her fingers in the wool. He thought of Edmund's hand held in his, small and hot and trusting. Mother, he said. And this time there was no courtly finish of the word, only a plea every man thinks he will never make after childhood. She is not what you think. The dowager's gaze went colder. I think she is a mirror held up to your grief by a hand that wishes to profit from it. I am not a fool, he said. No, she agreed. You are a man. She let the insult fold into the pronouncement like a spice into wine. And a man who walks into a room with his ghosts around his throat is easy to lead. He did not look away. He held her stare like a rope. I brought her here, he said with care, because to leave her there would have been cruelty done in my name. Better cruelty than scandal, she said, and there it was, the thesis of her life. He let it lie on the rug like a dropped blade. You will send for the council, she continued. If she remains under this roof by nightfall, there will be talk that I do not care to hear. She touched the bell on the table with one finger. It trembled, but did not ring. You will not indulge this fancy in my house. He stood. The attendants' gazes remained fixed on a point in the air between the mantel and his shoulder. I will not parade her, he said. I will not question her in the hall where the scullions can count the time she breathes. He bowed again, lower this time, not to appease her but to grant himself a moment to put his face back where it belonged. I ask you to trust me. She made a sound that was not laughter, not precisely. Trust is extended to those who do not ask for it. Then extend it to your son, he said, and felt the word son cut both ways. She moved toward the fire and put out her hands to it. The blaze did not need her. Do not speak to me as if I were a woman who must be softened, she said. Speak to me as a queen. He nodded once. As you wish. As I must. She turned, the light catching the fine lines around her mouth and making them deeper. You will not play host to that woman another day in this house without summoning the council to judge the matter. Prince Alistair chose the garden because it was a place that could still pretend to be private. The palace yards, when trimmed and ordered, kept secrets with a gentleness that halls did not. Paths of crushed gravel curved between beds of late roses and boxwood clipped to patient shapes. A fountain murmured beneath a statue whose features had been softened by rain and time. He walked those paths with the steadiness of a man trying to think his way out of grief, one foot placed in front of the other, the mind cataloging what would be said and what should be left unsaid. He sent 2 guards to a distance and another to keep watch behind a hedgerow. The captain received the instructions like a man taking up a handful of cold coals. He would hold them, but had no claim to warmth. The prince asked for discretion in the tone of a man used to giving commands that weighed like iron. He asked also for gentleness, a concession he did not like to make, but which he felt now as a necessity. The guards dispersed like ripples, leaving a circle of quiet. Alistair stood beneath a yew as the woman was brought in on the arm of a soldier, who kept his gaze polite and downward. The light shifted through the leaves and made small moving lanterns on her coat. Up close, the raggedness sharpened into particulars. A tear mended crudely across a sleeve, calluses on the palms of hands that might once have known a glove, a scar at the knuckle like an unfinished word. Those markers of poverty moved across him, less like evidence than like a ledger balanced by a human face. He had expected shock. What he had not expected was the way his skin warmed at the sight of small domestic gestures she made without intending them. The careful smoothing of her skirt where a stone had caught, the way she cradled a stray moth in her cupped hands before letting it fly away. He kept his distance because proximity breeds things he could not yet bear. Touch, pity, the accidental naming of the dead. The garden offered conversation that could breathe. He watched her at first through the narrow aperture of someone looking for a fault to justify curiosity. Then, as minutes grew long and the rustle of leaves sang a private noise, he watched as a man watches a debt being paid. Nothing in her comportment suggested malice. If a trick had been played, it was not an obvious one. She ate a piece of bread with the careful attention of someone who measured consumption like currency. She accepted a piece of fruit from a servant with a pause that read, in his mind, less as suspicion than as the exquisite courtesy of a person who had once had better things and did not want to waste even the memory of them. He wanted to ask her how she had come to be a figure lying in a lane. He wanted also to know whether the resemblance that tightened his chest was a mirror or a wound. That dual hunger made his questions both sharper and softer. He began with small things, where she had last slept, whether she was in need of a physician, and let the more perilous inquiries hang back like a hand pretending to offer a glove before it picks a lock. His voice was steady, his questions were precise. He had learned, in court, how to dress interrogation as courtesy. She answered with a caution grown from necessity. Her words were fewer than his, and each one walked close to the edge of what she wanted to be understood. She stated what could be proven, routes taken, towns crossed, the kind of employers who had kept her for a half-season. She would not give the names that might sharpen into accusation. Yet she did not deny certain small things that could be neither invented nor easily misplaced. The sound of lullabies that spoke of a nursery, a mark on a wrist no longer visible to strangers, but remembered by the tenderness of a woman who once dressed a child. She kept her past in fragments because whole stories can be seized and weaponized. Fragments are like flint. If they catch, they kindle a flame that can be controlled. There were moments when she looked at him not as a prince, but as a man who could offer steadiness. Those were the moments that unsettled him most. He had not anticipated tenderness rising in him under the peculiar pressure of the resemblance. Grief had a way of making a man charitable with his own heart when it wanted company. He found himself wishing she might be allowed a place at the palace table for an evening, if only to mark that a human being had a roof and a seat. He stopped himself from entertaining the thought. There were rules here, iron lines that had been drawn by need and fear and the lesson of previous rulers. She kept touching at the hem of her sleeve as if there was a seam she wanted to set right. The motion said more than her words. It spoke of a person who had once been taught to look sharpened at the edges, who had learned to make do with less and yet hold her posture as though one could straighten the world by standing straight. She admitted, with a small, almost reluctant laugh that was more like a cough, that she had been taken into service as a child and then lost to it, moved to other hands and other roofs until no hand seemed a safe place to lay one's head. When he asked whether anyone had ever called her by another name, she allowed the shadow of a smile, not warm but secretive. She said she had been called many names, names for favors, names for seasons, but she would not speak of the one that perhaps mattered. It was a refusal that carried its own truth. Names are anchors and also maps. To surrender the map is to be untethered. He watched the way her fingers brushed the locket she kept close beneath her blouse, a thing he had not noticed until then. She did not make a show of it. She adjusted it as though to assure herself it existed. He asked lightly, an official mask softening a harder edge, what had made her walk the lane that morning. She looked at the fountain, then at the roses, at the way the light fell through leaves. and for a moment, the palace softened in the space between them. She answered that the city had been colder than the last place she had found shelter, and that she had wandered where the sound of many people promised warmth. Her voice held no attempt to beg. It was an account given to someone he hoped would understand that suffering need not be trimmed into drama for sympathy. He realized then that the thing between them was not merely resemblance. It was a third presence, the boy who had broken silence earlier and pointed with such absolute faith. Edmund's name shaped itself into the air between them like a small, dangerous offering. The child had done what children do with truth. He had spoken it without thinking of the consequences. The prince felt a movement inside him like a hand pushing him toward a decision. They spoke of small mercy and large consequence, of what might be permitted where prudence now reigned. He suggested privacy. She preferred a bench in sun where the air was honest. He watched the way the light made a line down her cheek and thought of portrait painters who try to catch something that runs away when you look directly at it. The conversation wandered to safe terrain, an old illness they had both known, a common herb for cough, until it did not. A question he meant only as a measure of truth cut sharper than he had intended. Had she ever had a guardian who sang a lullaby using the same odd cadence as the one his son's wet nurse used? She paused. She looked at the rosebush and did not answer directly. Her silence sounded like a hinge that might open. "You remember things in a way that is not ordinary," he said, because the garden made him brave. She let out a breath. "Memory is a house that keeps its own furniture," she answered. "Sometimes you find a chair in the wrong room and you sit because it is there." His chest tightened. He did not ask the next question aloud. He did not need to. In the space set by hedges and sun and a fountain's patient song, questions lived unspoken between men and women who are suddenly careful of what they will confess. He wanted to press her for the truth. He wanted also to shelter the partial honesty he already had. That is the double bind of a man who must govern both the heart and a realm. They were not given the luxury of an endless afternoon. A courtier who had been passing through on private business noted the prince's proximity to the woman and paused in the shade to watch. He did not approach, only observed with a merciless attention that has the habit of turning curiosity into consequence. A single look, a whisper slipped into a pocket of a coat, a half-step toward a servant who had been trained to carry words as efficiently as platters. All smaller things travel faster in a house built of eyes. The courtier retreated with the noiselessness of a man who knows when he carries news that will be useful. He moved like a shadow that has learned its usefulness in a court where shadows can be traded. Within the hour, the whisper condensed into a named concern, and then a named accusation, that the prince harbored a woman who resembled the late princess. The garden's privacy dissolved along a seam no wider than a scribe's pen. Word flowed from the hedges to corridors, and from corridors to the antechamber that fed the dowager's rooms. Alistair felt the breach like a pinprick. He had known flattery, counsel, and deceit. Rumor, too, was a weapon those who feared power used to shore up their holdings. He rose from the bench because standing keeps you ready and because sitting makes you look like you have time to be surprised by treachery. The woman watched him, reading his shoulders like a map. She lifted her hand in a small sign of understanding that was neither submission nor entreaty. A page boy arrived at a trot with a note folded in the haste of service. Alistair broke the seal with the economy of a man who has learned how many messages a life can hold. The note was brief and precise. The dowager wished him in her parlor at once. The last line carried weight he could feel in his bones. She had been told what had happened in the garden and had summoned him to account for it. He posed to the woman that he would return shortly and offered an arm if she wished company to the nearer path. She declined with a shake that had the absolute finality of a person who had learned not to place hopes on what might be taken away. He wanted to press the request for her safety. He realized he wanted it because the boy's face hovered in his memory like a compass he had not been given the right to follow. As he turned to leave, the woman's eyes followed him with an intensity that was not quite fear and not quite hope. He met that look and felt the uncompromising truth that some lives change by an inch and some by a decision. He stepped away with his stride measured to the pace of a man walking into a parlor where power did not prefer unknowns. By the time he reached the doorway of the dowager's antechamber, the air had already been populated with the start of a crowd's attention. Courtiers angled toward the door with the gravity of vultures who mistook color for feast. A footman slipped a bow that was not quite low enough and not quite high enough, the error of someone thinking he must appear casual when he wanted to be noticed. The dowager's messenger waited in the anteroom like a judge with a pen. Alistair bowed and moved past him. In the garden, behind hedges and the silver of the fountain, the woman sat very still and pressed her hands together until the knuckles whitened. Her body made itself small, a map of economy. The sound of feet grew nearer as more people began to speak her name in hushed tones. She had been offered privacy and received it, but the palace had not stayed its mechanisms to allow such things to remain unexamined. She felt the change like a hand on a bell. It would not stop until someone pulled the rope. From the antechamber, the dowager would say a single thing that would not merely be a reprimand, but a demand, that the woman be called to answer to the council. The council chamber waited like a mouth about to speak. The long table gleamed with polish. Those scratches along the edges betrayed decades of fists and rings that had struck it in anger. Tapestries depicting past victories hung heavy, their threads dulled by candle smoke. Along the benches, nobles arranged themselves with studied composure, voices lowered yet sharp with the thrill of expectation. They had been summoned in haste, and the scent of damp wool and travel clung to them still. The air was thick with something stronger than smoke. Anticipation sharpened into suspicion. Prince Alistair entered with a soldier's bearing, his coat straight, his step measured. He had spent years in these chambers learning how to command his own face. That discipline steadied him now, though the knot in his chest pulled tight. Every gaze turned to him, measuring, waiting to hear whether this scandal belonged to him or to some nameless misfortune dragged in from the street. He inclined his head briefly to the chamberlain, then took his place at the head of the table. The doors opened again. Guards escorted the woman inside. She walked rather than being carried, though her movements carried the hesitancy of someone aware she was on display. The plain dress given to her hung loose but clean, its simplicity doing nothing to disguise the shape of her face. Gasps moved quietly along the benches, restrained but audible. She lowered her eyes, refusing the power of their stares, and folded her hands together as though she could still command dignity by force of will. The Dowager Queen sat upright, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, eyes cold and sharp. She did not look at the woman at first. She looked at her son. The message in her gaze was plain. You brought this shadow into our house. You will now see what it makes of you. Alistair inclined his head to her, acknowledging without yielding, then signaled the guards to step back. He would not have her paraded like a prisoner, though the room already judged her as one. The chamberlain called for silence. His voice carried the rhythm of ritual, though the words themselves bore sharp edges. This woman stands before us under suspicion. She was found in the city and brought into the palace by His Highness. Her likeness to the late Princess Eleanor is remarked upon. The council will determine the truth of her presence. The murmurs that followed were not agreement, but appetite. Alistair leaned forward, his voice steady. She is a human being before she is a curiosity. She will be heard fairly. His tone offered no invitation for dispute, but a ripple of discontent stirred regardless. The dowager's lips tightened. The woman lifted her head slightly, meeting his gaze for a heartbeat. In that brief moment, he saw gratitude flicker beneath her caution. The first questions came from a thin-faced noble who thrived on scandal. "What is your name?" he demanded. The woman gave it softly, each syllable worn by years of disuse. The noble sneered as though the sound itself offended him. "Where were you born?" She hesitated, then admitted she did not know. "Convenient," the man replied, letting the word curl into the chamber like smoke. Others shifted, suspicion mounting. The interrogation pressed forward, each question sharper than the last. Where had she lived? Who had claimed her? What labor had she done? Her answers were fragmented, halting, as though each one risked tearing open a wound. Some counselors muttered about deceit. Others leaned closer, hearing something unpolished, yet true in the tremor of her voice. She described moving from house to house, work offered then withdrawn, winters endured in barns or beneath broken roofs. She spoke not to beg but to state, and the starkness unsettled even those eager to condemn her. Alistair felt anger stir low in his chest. These men, fat with privilege, examined her like merchants weighing goods. He longed to shield her from the hunger in their eyes. Yet he knew that any sign of protectiveness would be read as weakness. He steadied his hands on the table and reminded himself that silence, for now, was its own defense. Then she reached into the folds of her dress. A murmur swept the chamber as she drew out a locket, its chain tarnished, the casing dented from years of wear. She held it delicately, as though it were the only thing that had not been taken from her. Gasps rose when the crest etched upon its surface caught the candlelight. Though worn, the design was unmistakable. A royal emblem, known to every noble in the room. Alistair's heart jolted. He remembered the crest from his youth, a mark once used in the nursery for small keepsakes. The resemblance was undeniable. Yet before he could speak, the dowager's voice cut through the chamber, sharp and commanding. "Bring it to me." The woman hesitated, fingers tightening around the chain. Her eyes met Alistair's again, pleading, resisting, afraid. He gave the faintest nod, urging her not to invite harsher suspicion. With visible reluctance, she placed the locket in the hand of the nearest guard, who carried it to the dowager. The queen held it aloft, her expression a mask of cold triumph. "Proof," she said, her voice carrying to every corner. "Proof not of her claim but of conspiracy. Such a thing does not fall into the hands of a beggar by chance. It is stolen, or it is given with intent. In either case, it is treachery." The words struck the chamber like a hammer. Murmurs rose to a swell, some agreeing, others whispering doubts. Alistair rose halfway from his seat. "It proves nothing of the sort. It may prove heritage as easily as theft." His voice carried iron now, and silence rippled outward, his eyes locked on his mother's. Condemnation without cause is not justice. It is fear dressed in authority. The dowager's lips curved, but not in warmth. "And hope dressed as justice is no less dangerous. Would you risk your throne on a likeness and a trinket?" Her gaze slid to the woman. "This is not heritage. It is manipulation." The woman's hands trembled at her sides. She drew them into fists, as though to hold herself upright against the weight of accusation. Her eyes darted to Alistair, not for rescue, but as if to anchor herself in the only gaze that had not yet condemned her. For a moment, silence thickened, every noble present waiting to see whether the prince would shield her or step aside. Alistair's jaw tightened. He knew he could not shield her fully, not yet, not here. His defense would be read as personal entanglement, and personal entanglement was currency too easily spent. He forced his voice into a measured calm. "Then, let us examine it properly. Do not declare conspiracy before the council has weighed truth. If the locket is stolen, it will be proven. If not, then we face a matter far greater." The dowager did not answer him directly. She held the locket like a trophy and turned to the chamber. Until its origin is certain, the woman remains confined. She will not move freely under this roof. Guards will hold her until judgment is rendered. She let her gaze rest on her son, cold as frost. "And you will remember, Alistair, that sentiment is the first step toward ruin." The chamber filled again with murmurs, agreement laced with unease. Alistair lowered himself slowly back into his chair, though his hands remained tight on the wood. The woman's eyes closed briefly, a flicker of despair passing through her. She had been brought into the palace with a sliver of dignity, Now she was reduced once more to a figure held by command. He watched her draw a slow breath, squaring her shoulders even as guards stepped closer. In the silence that followed, the locket caught the light once more, gleaming like a secret too dangerous to hold. The dowager's voice cut through again, final and merciless. "This locket is not inheritance. It is evidence of a plot, and she will answer for it." The palace was a hive that night, corridors alive with footsteps and whispers. What had been murmured in corners now spilled freely from chamber to chamber. The council's judgment had not silenced anything. It had fed the appetite for scandal. Servants moved with lowered eyes, careful not to be accused of listening, though their ears caught every word. Nobles, summoned for a banquet long planned, arrived with sharper curiosity than hunger. The Dowager Queen's decision to place the beggar woman before them turned the evening from feast to spectacle. In the great hall, chandeliers blazed, their candles multiplied in tall mirrors. Tables spread with silver and crystal glimmered like armor. Music drifted from a trio of strings tucked discreetly near the dais, their bows moving with discipline, though the notes could not drown the restlessness of the crowd. Men and women in jeweled coats and silks exchanged glances more than pleasantries, each waiting for the same moment, the unveiling of the woman who bore the dead princess's face. Prince Alistair entered at the head of the procession, his son Edmund at his side. He carried himself with the calm of a soldier walking into battle. His eyes surveyed the hall, gauging expressions, cataloguing alliances and betrayals in the flicker of a fan, the arch of an eyebrow. He could feel the pressure of expectation. If he looked at the woman too long, gossip would bloom. If he ignored her, suspicion would deepen. A prince's silence was never empty. It was filled with the meaning others chose to give it. The doors opened again. Guards brought her in. She wore the same plain gown, though now washed and pressed, as though clean cloth might quiet the storm. It did not. The resemblance to Eleanor was undeniable. Conversations faltered, wine cups froze halfway to mouths, and even the music wavered before the players caught themselves. Faces turned as one toward her. Some held fear, others awe, a few thinly veiled envy. She moved stiffly, her shoulders square despite the weight of eyes. The dowager had placed her deliberately in the open, not hidden among servants, but in view of every guest. She was to be judged by glances, as well as by counsel. She stood at the margin of the hall, under the blaze of chandeliers that made her every gesture visible. Alistair's breath tightened in his chest. He saw her fingers clasp together, then unclasp, as though she reminded herself to stand without shrinking. The child was the first to break through the tension. Edmund slipped from his nurse's hand and ran to her. His small arms wrapped around her skirt, clinging with the instinct of recognition he could not explain. Gasps rustled like wind through wheat. To many it looked like a ghost welcomed back by her own son. Alistair strode forward quickly, his steps measured but urgent, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay close," he murmured, but Edmund refused to let go of the woman's dress. Her hand hovered above the child's hair, trembling before it touched. When it did, it was light as a breath. She did not claim him, she comforted him. The subtlety of the gesture only deepened the impression of intimacy. Around them, the nobles whispered fiercely, fans fluttering like wings. Alistair felt heat climb his neck but forced his face to remain composed. Every movement was being carved into rumor even as it happened. The banquet began, though food was hardly tasted. The woman remained standing, a figure at the edge of the table, her presence more potent than the roasted fowl or gleaming pies. Alistair, seated opposite his mother, felt her gaze like steel pressing against him. She had arranged this moment to expose weakness, to test how far he would go to protect the stranger. He lifted his cup with studied ease, forcing conversation with the noble at his right, though his attention never left her. As the evening dragged, the whispers grew bold enough to become remarks spoken near her. Some questioned aloud whether sorcery had given her Eleanor's face. Others muttered of imposture, of schemes born in the gutters. She did not answer. Her silence was her only defense, and it made her appear more enigmatic. Each refusal to respond turned suspicion into fascination. Then, from among the attendants at the far side of the hall, an older woman faltered. She had been pouring wine with a steadiness born of habit, but now her hand shook. Her eyes widened, fixed on the locket that gleamed in the dowager's possession. The color drained from her face. She pressed a hand to her chest, lips moving as if to stifle words, but the words burst out anyway. "I know that piece," she cried, her voice carrying across the chamber, silencing the strings mid-note. "By all the saints, I know it." All heads turned. The dowager stiffened, annoyance flashing before it was replaced by calculation. Alistair leaned forward, pulse quickening. The servant was not young. Lines marked her face, and her hair showed the silver of years. Yet her gaze was sharp, not clouded by age. She stared at the woman in the plain gown, then at the locket, then back again, as though the world had just rearranged itself before her eyes. She stepped forward, the flagstones echoing beneath her hurried tread. "I was there," she said, voice trembling yet resolute. "I was there when the princess was born. I was there when the cradle held not one child, but two." A wave of shock rippled through the hall, louder than any music. Wine spilled, unheeded. A noble's fork clattered to the table. The woman at the center of it all swayed slightly, as though the floor itself had shifted beneath her. The old midwife pointed with a hand that shook but did not falter. Her eyes shone with sudden clarity. "This is no impostor. This is no thief. She is the twin, lost when the cradle was divided. She is blood of the crown." Gasps broke the chamber into chaos, nobles speaking over one another, some rising to their feet, others clutching at pearls or crosses. The music ceased altogether. Alistair's heart thundered in his chest. The dowager's face hardened into stone, but for the first time, there was something else beneath the fury: fear. The hall erupted, every whisper turning into a roar, every guest demanding to know the truth. The woman at the center of it all stood frozen, the locket's absence at her throat suddenly unbearable, the weight of a revelation she had not asked for pressing down upon her. And in the stunned silence that followed the uproar, all eyes turned to Prince Alistair, waiting for his next move. The great hall still trembled with the echo of the midwife's cry. The nobles who had moments before leaned toward their plates now stood in knots, voices clashing, fans snapping shut like little blades. The musicians had set down their bows. The last note still quivered in the air like a dying bird. Prince Alistair rose slowly. He did not slam his chair back. He lifted himself with deliberate calm, the kind that carried more weight than thunder. His eyes swept the room. The crowd quieted enough for the scrape of a knife on porcelain to sound too loud. The woman at the center of it all had not moved. Her breath came sharp and shallow, her hands pressed against her gown, as though to hold herself together. "Enough," Alistair said, not loud, but the word reached. His gaze cut to the dowager. "This chamber will not become a marketplace." The queen's lips curled as if she had expected this. Her reply was low, but meant for all to hear. "When a beggar woman is claimed as royal blood, we are already in the marketplace." The old midwife stood trembling, her hands clutched together. "I swear what I saw," she insisted. "Two babes, alike as dawn and dusk. One placed in the cradle of silk, one taken." Her voice broke, but she forced it on. "That locket was meant to keep them joined. I know it as I know my own hands." Gasps spread again. Some nobles demanded proof. Others muttered that the woman was mad, or worse, bribed. The dowager struck her cane against the floor, silencing them. "You will not take the word of a servant over the sanctity of this house." "She has spoken treason," Alistair stepped forward. "She has spoken memory. Whether true or false, we cannot dismiss it with a gesture." His eyes flicked to the woman, whose face held both disbelief and fear. She looked at him not as a supplicant, but as one who had been pulled into a storm she never sought. He felt the pull in his chest deepen, as though duty itself demanded he shield her. The dowager's gaze turned icy. Then shield her you must, for the moment. But she will not walk these halls unguarded. Until we know the truth, she is a danger. She turned to the captain of the guard. Confine her. The woman stiffened. Her eyes widened, and for an instant Alistair thought she might fall. He stepped closer, as though the act alone could lend her strength. His voice came low, urgent, meant for her alone. Stand. Do not let them strip you of your dignity. Her lips parted as though to answer, but no words came. The guards moved forward. The boy, Edmund, cried out, breaking free from his nurse and running again to the woman's side. He clung to her, and this time she could not stop herself. Her hand rested on his shoulder with fierce protectiveness. The hall erupted again, nobles pointing, some exclaiming that the boy himself recognized her blood. The dowager's eyes narrowed to slits. "Remove her," she commanded. "Now!" Alistair caught his son by the arm. Edmund resisted, his small voice sharp. "Don't let them take her, father." It pierced Alistair more than any noble's condemnation. He pulled the child close, meeting the woman's eyes over the boy's head. She shook her head ever so slightly, not pleading, warning. The guards guided her away, not roughly, but with a firmness that left no room for resistance. The crowd parted, whispers snapping at her heels. She walked upright, her face pale, her eyes fixed forward, as though if she looked at no one could claim her. The locket remained in the dowager's hand, gleaming like a weapon. Alistair pressed Edmund back into his nurse's arms. The boy fought him, kicking against her skirts, his small voice hoarse with protest. Alistair's hand lingered a moment longer than it should have on the woman's shoulder as she passed. He felt the tremor beneath her composure, the raw strength it took not to collapse. The contact lasted only a breath, but it branded itself on him. The doors closed behind her. The sound was final. The nobles shifted again, conversation rising, theories spinning wild. Alistair returned to his seat, but he did not touch his cup. His hands clenched the arms of his chair until the wood creaked. Across from him, the dowager sat with quiet victory. She had the locket, and she had the woman confined. Yet her eyes betrayed unease. The midwife's words had cut deeper than she cared to show. The banquet limped on, but the feast lay untouched. Gossip had more flavor than meat. Alistair excused himself early, ignoring the calls of nobles who pressed for clarity. His path took him through dim corridors, where the light fell in long, cold shafts. He passed servants who bowed quickly and shrank back, eager not to meet his eye. At the end of the east wing he found the chamber. 2 guards stood rigid outside. He dismissed them with a nod. They obeyed, though reluctantly, leaving the prince alone with the heavy wooden door. He opened it and stepped inside. She sat near the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not rise when he entered, only lifted her eyes. The firelight carved shadows on her face, deepening the resemblance that haunted him. For a moment he did not speak. He simply looked at her, and she at him, the silence thick with everything neither could yet say. At last she whispered, "Is this how mercy feels?" Her voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Alistair closed the door behind him. This is not mercy. This is survival. Yours or mine? He let the question hang. He crossed the room and stood before the fire. The warmth did nothing to ease the chill in his chest. The council will weigh the locket. They will question the midwife. Until then, they see you as a threat. I have been a threat before, she said, her lips tightening. Not to kingdoms, only to men who thought a woman's silence belonged to them. The punishment feels the same. Her honesty cut through him. He turned toward her fully. Do you understand what they believe? If the locket is true, you are not only a woman with a familiar face, you are blood of the crown. She shook her head. I am no one's crown." Her eyes met his with a fierceness that startled him. "Do not put that weight on me. I never asked for it." He stepped closer, unable to stop himself. The air between them felt taut, charged with something both dangerous and undeniable. "And yet it has found you." For a long moment, they stood in silence. The fire crackled. Outside the door, footsteps passed, muffled and quick. Inside, the distance between them shrank without either moving. His hand lifted as though to reach for hers, then stopped, curling back at his side. She exhaled, the sound breaking like glass. "If they mean to send me away, tell me now. Do not let me hope in a house that does not want me." His throat tightened. He wanted to promise her safety, to swear she would not be cast aside. But promises, in this palace, were weapons waiting to be twisted. He could not bind her with words he might not be able to keep. Instead, he said, "You will not be forgotten." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She turned her face toward the fire, unwilling to let him see more. He watched her, torn between duty and something he dared not name. The urge to protect her warred with the knowledge that every step toward her drew him deeper into peril. A sharp rap on the door broke the fragile stillness. The captain's voice came from the hall, brisk and unyielding. "Your Highness, orders from the Queen. The woman is to be moved under guard until her fate is decided." Alistair's jaw clenched. He looked at her one last time, and she looked back with a steadiness that belied her shaking hands. The moment stretched, a thread ready to snap. The door opened, and soldiers entered, their faces set. The dowager had given her verdict. The woman would be banished at dawn. The night hung heavy in the east wing, the air dense with the smell of damp stone and smoke from the torches burning low in the sconces. Beyond the barred windows, rain pattered on the courtyard, steady and insistent, as if reminding those within that freedom waited just beyond the walls. Inside the guarded chamber, Serafina sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap. She did not sleep. She had not closed her eyes since the guards left her with the warning. At dawn, the gates would open, and she would be driven out forever. The fire in the grate had burned low. Its glow brushed the floor in thin stripes, making shadows of her knees and the curve of her bowed head. Each crackle of coal marked another moment lost, another beat of the heart she could not slow. She listened to the guards outside, their boots shifting, their muffled voices rising and falling. They were not cruel men, but they were dutiful, and duty had been declared against her. She thought of the boy, his arms wrapped around her skirt, his head pressed against her side as though she were the only shelter he knew. She thought of the prince, his hand on her shoulder in that instant of passing, his gaze both shield and chain. She had not asked for either bond, yet both lived in her now like breath. She feared carrying them out of the palace more than she feared the exile itself. The door opened softly. Alistair stepped inside, cloaked against the damp, his face pale in the flickering light. He closed the door behind him, but his hand lingered on the latch as though he might need to bar it against the world. His eyes found hers, and in that silence there was no title, no crown, only a man staring at a woman he was about to lose. "You are trying to flee," he said quietly. It was not accusation, it was recognition. Her chin lifted, and her lips parted in protest, then closed again. The truth sat between them, unspoken but undeniable. Her glance flicked to the window, to the iron latch that had tempted her all evening, and then back to him. "Would you stay," she whispered, "if the walls themselves told you they meant to bury you?" Alistair stepped forward. The fire painted one half of his face in gold, the other in shadow. "You have been wronged, but running tonight will seal their judgment. They already call you a fraud. Flee, and you give them proof." She rose, her fists clenched at her sides. "What do they call it if I stay? Submission? Guilt? I will not sit like a lamb and wait for them to drive me out at dawn. I would rather take my fate into my own hands, even if it leads only to the river." His voice deepened, sharp with urgency. And if the guards had found you in the corridor, do you know what whispers would follow then? That you came to steal, to spy, to poison. Do you understand? You cannot win this battle alone. She turned her face away, fighting the sting in her eyes. I have fought every battle alone, since I can remember. Her breath trembled. I have been cold. I have been starved. I have been broken and sold and left behind. And still, I stood. But this place is worse, because here I am told I resemble what I never knew. I am punished for the face I did not choose. His hand twitched as though to reach for her, but he stilled it. You think I do not see that? Every word spoken against you tonight cut into me like a blade. They call you fraud to wound me as much as you. Do not doubt it. Her gaze snapped back to his. Then why let them? Why not open that door now and tell them who I am? Or are you afraid of what it would mean if you admitted it? That you might want me here for reasons that have nothing to do with truth? The words fell between them like sparks. Alistair drew in a breath, steadying himself against the force of her challenge. Do you think I am blind to my own weakness? He asked, low, almost raw. Do you think I do not know what it is to see your face and feel the past clawing back at me? Every look at you is a betrayal of the woman I buried. And yet, when I try to turn away, I cannot. That is my shame, and my burden. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hiss of the fire. Her lips trembled, though her voice held when she spoke. And what am I then? A shadow? A reminder? A mistake to be carried like guilt? He stepped closer, the distance collapsing until only a breath separated them. His eyes locked on hers, fierce with unspoken need. No, he said, and the word shook in his chest. You are the first thing in years that feels alive. She swayed, caught between stepping back and falling forward. Her pulse raced in her throat. The fire painted them both in restless light, daring them toward the precipice of confession. Her hand lifted, almost against her will, hovering near his chest. She stopped short, her fingers trembling in the air. The sound of boots outside shattered the moment. A knock came, sharp and final. The captain's voice carried through the wood, clipped and cold. Your Highness, it is time. Alistair did not move. He stared at her, every muscle in his body pulled taut between defiance and obedience. She lowered her hand slowly, her breath shallow, her eyes bright with 1,000 unsaid things. The latch turned. The door swung wide. Guards filled the threshold, their faces grim, their orders clear. The Dowager had given her decree, and they had come to carry it out. Alistair placed himself between them and the woman, his cloak flaring as he stepped forward. His voice was iron, unyielding. She does not leave this room tonight. The captain stiffened. Your Highness, the Queen commands. Then let her command me directly, Alistair cut in, his tone low but searing. Until she does, no one touches her. The guards hesitated, caught between two powers. The woman behind him pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling, not from fear of exile now, but from the cost she saw written on his face. He had crossed a line, and both knew it. The silence thickened, the fire crackling like a drumbeat. Then the captain lowered his head, retreating a step, though his eyes warned that this defiance would not be forgotten. The guards followed, closing the door once more, leaving the two alone with the echo of what had just passed. Alistair turned back to her. The weight of his choice hung heavy in the air, binding them together in a bond neither had spoken, yet both had felt. And beyond the door, in the corridors of the palace, the Dowager's voice was already rising, sharp and merciless, demanding obedience. The morning broke grey, a thin mist creeping down from the hills and settling over the palace courtyard. The flagstones glistened damp, the sound of soldiers' boots echoing against the walls as they prepared for the departure. A carriage waited at the centre, plain but unmistakably official, its dark wood polished for ceremony, its wheels rimmed with iron. Horses shifted restlessly in their harnesses, breath steaming in the chill air. The courtyard filled with eyes, servants peering from the staircases, chambermaids pressing handkerchiefs to their lips, guards lined in rigid formation. At the high steps, the Dowager Queen stood like a carved figure, her shawl drawn close, her cane gripped with authority. Her command had been carried out. At dawn, the woman was to be sent beyond the city gates. The Queen's expression gave no hint of conflict. Her rule had been one of cold decisions, and this was no different. Inside the east wing, Serafina waited under guard. Her dress was the same as the night before. Though a fresh cloak had been draped over her shoulders, the gesture meant less as kindness than as a sign that the crown would not be accused of cruelty. Her eyes were hollow, as if sleep had been a stranger all night. Yet her back remained straight, her chin lifted just enough to keep dignity intact. Prince Alistair entered without ceremony. The guards stiffened but did not bar him. His presence was command enough. He paused a moment in the doorway, his breath visible in the cold draught. Their eyes met. The silence between them was more eloquent than words. "They mean to take you now," he said at last. Her lips curved, but it was no smile. "Then let them." He stepped closer. "You do not have to go quietly." "What choice is left to me?" she asked, her voice raw. "If I fight, I prove them right. If I obey, I am erased. Either way, I lose." Alistair's jaw tightened. He wanted to promise her safety, but the words would be brittle in this house. Instead, he lowered his voice. "If you go today, know that I will not let them bury the truth. I will find a way to bring it to light." Her eyes softened, though fear shadowed them still. "Truth is a dangerous gift. Be careful it does not cost you more than me." A knock struck the door. The captain entered, his tone clipped. "It is time." Serafina drew a breath, steadying herself. She turned to Alistair, her voice low enough for him alone. "If they cast me out, do not follow. Protect your son." His hand twitched at his side, aching to reach for hers, but he forced it still. He leaned closer, his words barely more than breath. "Protecting him means protecting you." The guards moved, guiding her forward. She did not resist. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one an act of defiance. Alistair followed, his presence a shield, though no order had granted him the right. They emerged into the courtyard. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, all eyes fixed on the woman who bore the princess's face. Edmund, held tight by his nurse near the steps, broke free once more and ran forward. His cry pierced the stillness. "Don't take her!" The nurse hurried after him, but the boy clung to the hem of Serafina's cloak. His small body shook with sobs, his eyes fierce. The crowd gasped. To them, the child's gesture looked like recognition, a bond deeper than reason. Alistair stepped forward quickly, scooping his son into his arms. He held the boy close, whispering something meant to calm, but Edmund's tears wet his father's collar. Serafina's hand hovered in the air, aching to comfort, before she drew it back against her cloak. She knew a single touch could be twisted into accusation. The dowager's voice rang out, cold and unwavering. "Take her away." The guards guided Serafina toward the carriage. Her steps faltered once at the threshold. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drawn to the high steps where the Queen stood. It was not a plea. It was a silent reckoning. Then she lifted her chin and placed her foot on the carriage step. But before she could mount, a voice rang out from the far side of the courtyard, high and trembling but urgent. An older woman, bent with years yet clear of eye, pushed forward through the servants. The guards tried to stop her, but she raised her hand, her words louder than the commotion. "Wait! You cannot send her away. You cannot—" The dowager's gaze snapped to her, sharp as steel. "Who speaks?" The woman bowed low, but her voice did not waver. "I was in the royal nursery. I kept its secrets longer than I should, but no longer. I cannot bear it. That locket she carried—" Her voice cracked, but she forced it out. It was not stolen. It was given. I remember the night of 2 births. I remember the order to silence. I carried the weight of it these many years. A stunned hush swept the courtyard. Even the horses stilled. Alistair's breath caught. Serafina froze on the carriage step, her hands trembling. The old nurse's confession hung in the air like a tolling bell. The dowager's cane struck the stone once, a sound sharp enough to break the silence. Her face was pale now, though her voice held. "You will hold your tongue, woman." But the nurse straightened, her frail body trembling with conviction. "No more. Let them exile me if they wish. But let the truth be heard." The crowd stirred, murmurs swelling like a tide. Suspicion shifted into something sharper, questions that could no longer be pushed aside. Alistair's gaze darted to his mother, then to Serafina, whose face had gone white as snow. The nurse took another step forward, her voice breaking but resolute. "She is not a stranger. She is blood of the crown. She is the child you all lost." The words fell into the courtyard like a stone into water, sending ripples through every soul present. And the council, summoned at once, demanded that Serafina prove her bloodline publicly, or be cast away forever. The council chamber was packed beyond its usual gravity, every seat filled, every shadow along the wall claimed by a servant who pretended not to hear. The air was thick with anticipation, sharper than incense at a funeral. Candlelight flickered against the tapestries, gilding the faces of kings long dead, as though their painted eyes looked down to judge the living. Prince Alistair entered first, his boots striking the floor with calm deliberation. He held Edmund's hand in his, though the boy's grip was tight and anxious. The child looked around the chamber with eyes too young to understand the politics, but old enough to feel the danger. Alistair released him gently into the care of a waiting nurse, then walked to the head of the table. His expression was composed, but the heaviness in his shoulders betrayed the strain of days. Serafina was brought forward under guard, though this time no one dared to touch her more than necessary. She walked upright, her plain gown no disguise against the resemblance that silenced every murmur as she entered. Her gaze swept the chamber, steady though her fingers trembled against the folds of her cloak. When she reached the center, she stopped. The locket, once hidden against her skin, now lay in the dowager's possession upon the table like an exhibit of crime. The dowager sat rigid, her shawl drawn close. Her lips were pursed thin, her eyes cold as the iron rings on the council doors. Yet beneath the frost was something taut, something braced against fracture. The chamberlain spoke first. "The council has been summoned to weigh a grave matter. A woman stands accused of impersonation, yet others claim she is of royal blood. Tonight, truth must be drawn into light. Let no man or woman here speak without cause." His voice echoed in the vaulted ceiling, magnifying each syllable. A ripple passed through the council. Some leaned forward, eyes fixed on Serafina with fascination. Others leaned back, arms crossed, already skeptical. Alistair's gaze did not leave her. He knew what was coming would carve the fate of them both. The old nurse who had spoken in the courtyard stepped forward. She bent low, but her voice did not waver. "I was in the nursery the night the Queen bore her children. There were 2 girls. 2. One was placed in the cradle of state, the other carried away. I was sworn to silence. I held my tongue these many years, but my conscience is heavier than my fear." Gasps rippled across the chamber. Some nobles muttered disbelief. Others exchanged glances, calculating the cost of denial. The dowager's knuckles whitened on her cane. Alistair's voice cut through the whispers. "The locket was said to be stolen, yet it bears the crest of the nursery, a design known only within these walls. If it was stolen, then from this palace itself. If not, then it proves she belongs." The dowager struck her cane once against the floor. "Or it proves only that liars trade in relics. A face can be borrowed. A trinket can be stolen. We will not crown imposture." Serafina's voice broke the silence, low but clear. "I do not ask for crowns. I do not ask for thrones. I ask only that you look and see me. I carry no trick but the one life has played upon me." She turned, letting her gaze meet those assembled one by one. "If you think me fraud, say so to my face. If you think me blood, do not deny it because truth is inconvenient." A counselor rose, an older man with lines etched deep in his face. He gestured toward her hands. "There is a scar, is there not? A mark on the wrist?" Serafina hesitated, then slowly pulled back her sleeve. Faint but visible, a thin white scar traced her skin. The nurse gasped softly. "I remember it. She was marked as an infant. I tended it myself. I told no one, for the mark itself was proof." The council erupted in debate. Some voices rose, arguing she must be acknowledged. Others shouted fraud, witchcraft, danger to the crown. Alistair let the storm rage a moment before he stood. His height and calm silenced them more than any gavel. "You ask for proof," he said, his voice low yet carrying. "You ask for blood, but you ignore the truth before your eyes. You fear scandal more than you fear injustice. This woman has been dragged, questioned, humiliated, and still, she stands with dignity you cannot strip from her. If that is not the mark of royal blood, then I know not what is." His words drew murmurs of assent, though some still glared. He turned, his eyes locking on his mother's. "You fear she will ruin us. I tell you the opposite. She redeems us. To deny her now is to deny our own history." The dowager's lips trembled before she tightened them. For the first time, her silence was not command, but defense. The chamberlain spoke again, his voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "Let it be recorded. The council, having heard testimony and examined the locket, acknowledges the woman not as impostor, but as Serafina, twin of the late Princess Eleanor." The words fell into the chamber like a seal pressed to wax. Relief, shock, and awe rippled through the gathered nobles. Some bowed their heads, others looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze now that denial was impossible. Serafina's knees weakened, but she did not fall. Her eyes closed briefly, a breath of release escaping her. When she opened them, she met Alistair's gaze. He inclined his head ever so slightly, not as prince to subject, but as man to woman, equal to equal. The dowager remained seated, her hands rigid on her cane. She did not speak again. The silence around her was eloquent enough. Power had shifted, and she could not reclaim it with a word. Alistair stepped forward, his voice carrying the last verdict not of counsel, but of the heart. "She is not a ghost. She is not a trick. She is family. And she will remain so, whatever it costs." The chamber was still. Then slowly, nobles rose from their seats, bowing in reluctant acknowledgement. The murmur that followed was no longer gossip, but acceptance, heavy and inevitable. Serafina stood in the center of it all, no longer a beggar in rags, no longer a stranger at the gates. She was seen, named, restored. The locket gleamed once more in the light, no longer an accusation, but a bond returned. And in the quiet that followed, the weight of exile lifted from her shoulders at last. For a long heartbeat after the chamberlain's pronouncement, no one moved. The decision hung in the air like a bell's last vibration, too pure to touch. Then chairs scraped, cloth whispered, a few heads bowed, others held rigid with pride that had nowhere left to stand. Alistair exhaled and found breath again. He crossed the distance to Serafina not as a prince going to a subject, but as a man walking toward the center of the thing that had taken hold of his life. Nobles watched him like hawks that could not decide whether to swoop or stay their wings. She did not retreat. She stood very still, her hands clasped and bloodless, the plain gown steadying her like a rope. Her gaze lifted to meet his. She had a look he had not seen on any face in years, unguarded courage. It undid him more than tears would have. He stopped so near he could see the fine tremor along her jaw. "You stood by yourself," he said softly, voice for her alone. You will not stand alone again. She blinked, as if steadying the world. I have stood alone so long I hardly know how not to. Then let this be your first lesson in forgetting loneliness, he said, and could not keep the warmth from his voice. Across the table, the dowager's hand rested on the locket, as if it were a bit of steel still too hot to set down. It gleamed, not garish, but insistent. It had sat in this house as rumor and sign. Tonight, it returned to meaning. Alistair did not ask permission. He extended his hand. The request and the command lived in the same gesture. The dowager held his gaze. For a terrible second, years of mistrust and love and iron will ward in the space between them. Then she lifted the chain and laid it across his palm. It weighed almost nothing. He felt it like a sentence commuted. He did not turn back to Serafina at once. He crossed to Edmund first. The boy had broken free of his nurse again and hovered at the edge of a crowd that had never felt so tall. His face was blotched from tears he had refused to let fall. Alistair crouched, suddenly glad to be nearer the height of a child than a court. "Will you carry something that matters?" he asked in a low voice, meant for one pair of ears. Edmund's eyes widened, not with fear now, but with the solemnity of a task. He nodded hard. Alistair set the locket in his hands. Edmund's fingers closed around it, with reverence a boy reserves for a miracle he can touch. "Take it to her," Alistair said. "It belongs where it is seen." The boy walked with the care of a bearer charged with light. He stopped before Serafina and looked up, his mouth opening around 1,000 questions he didn't know he was allowed to ask. She knelt to receive him. It placed her below the eyeline of nobles and above the memory of a lane, perfectly situated between worlds. Edmund lifted the chain with a concentration that furrowed his brow. The metal caught candlelight and put a small fire beneath her chin. "May I?" he asked, almost a whisper. She bowed her head. He slipped the chain over her hair, clumsy but careful, his small fingers warm where they brushed her skin. The locket settled against her throat. For a moment, she closed her eyes. It was not a coronation. It was recognition, and it was enough to make her breath catch. When she raised her head, the chamber had transformed. It was still stone and wood and watchful faces, but it was also a room that had seen something righted. Even those who resisted felt it because truth alters gravity. The dowager sat as though the chair had grown heavier under her. The chamberlain wrote, "Hand steady because the record must serve those who come after." Alistair straightened. He offered his hand. It was not entirely formal, not entirely intimate. She looked at it for the length of 2 heartbeats, and then placed her fingers in his. He felt the fine bones under the skin, and every restrained impulse in him surged like a tide. He lifted their joined hands just enough that those watching would have to admit the fact of it. "Walk with me," he said. They crossed the chamber together with Edmund at her other side, small and fierce. Murmurs rose and clung to the beams like smoke. A few nobles stepped back to let them pass. 1 or 2 bowed their heads without knowing they had. No one tried to stop them. In the antechamber, the air was cooler, less scented by politics and sweat. Alistair did not release her hand until they reached the threshold to the corridor. There he paused to look down at her, as if to make sure the world had not shifted weirdly and left him alone again. "Are you steady?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and surprised herself with the truth in it. They moved through hallways that had just held whispers and now had to make space for something else. Servants pulled back against wood panels with the instinct born of lives spent at the edge of power. Yet their eyes shone. The news had already outrun the procession. Hope is faster than fear when it has a face to wear. They came to the side door that opened to the inner court. The night was crisp, the kind that carries sound and promise. Lanterns burned peacefully along the walls, their wicks trimmed to a steady glow. The stones underfoot held the day's heat, like a kindness returned after danger. Alistair signaled to the captain who had shadowed them without intruding. "At a distance," he said. "No parade." The captain nodded. He understood the difference between escort and display. He tucked his men back into the edges of dark so the family could have a path that was theirs. "Where are we going?" Serafina asked, not fearful, simply needing to set her feet inside the plan. "Home," he said, and then, because he heard the several meanings land too heavily, he added, "The road that led us here." She lifted her gaze to the sky. A few stars showed where clouds had pulled back. The garden perfume spilled softly over the wall. It felt as if the night had decided not to be unkind. They left by the small gate, the same one merchants used when called to deliver provisions. The city beyond breathed in a lower register now. Stalls were shuttered. Barrels stood like sleeping animals against posts. The market in Knight's Keeping had a softer face. It remembered morning, but did not pretend it was morning still. Edmund slipped his hand into hers as if he had always known where it fit. She looked down with startled tenderness and then carried on, the boy's trust an anchor strong enough to pull her out of the years. Alistair walked on her other side, close enough that the brush of their sleeves felt like a vow. "This lane," she murmured. "I thought I would die here by degrees." "Then let the city see you live," Alistair said, and his voice was equal parts command and prayer. They came to the place where she had lain. The wall still kept its damp. A scrap of twine clung to a nail. The echo of the crowd's murmur lived faintly in the stone, or perhaps memory made it so. Serafina stopped. She did not look small. She had learned to stand as though a line had been drawn around her and no one was permitted to cross it without consent. Edmund looked from the spot to her face, and then up at his father. "Is this where I said—" "Yes," Alistair answered, and put a hand on his son's head with a gentleness that defeated him. "This is where you told the truth before any of us dared." The boy's chest swelled with the simple pride that is the gift of being believed. He squeezed Serafina's fingers, and then, without asking, stepped a half-pace ahead as if to lead. Children do not wait for ushers when they know the way to kindness. A shutter creaked. A woman peered out and froze, unable to assemble what she saw. A lamplighter coming late stopped with his pole in mid-air. He lowered it slowly, cap coming off his head because habit does not argue with wonder. A man at the corner, folding nets, straightened, rope pooling around his feet. No herald shouted. No trumpets ran their bright noise along the street. The city simply understood. The bows were human, not choreographed. A few hands rose in a sign that simply meant welcome. A baker's boy, the same one who had tried to press in earlier in the week, ducked his head and then grinned so fiercely it made Serafina want to laugh and cry at once. "Do they accept me?" she asked, half to herself. "They accept you as something they had always suspected the world might allow. A truth that refuses to be dragged under," Alistair said. "That is more than most rulers get." She glanced at him. "You are tired of rule tonight." "I am tired," he said, and then let the rest remain in the air between them, where they could both touch it when ready. They walked on, the market offering them a benediction in rough wood and clean breath. A gutter tinkled where water found a path. A stray cat slipped by, businesslike in its patrol. The ordinary made its case for holiness. They did not go far. The city need not be circled to be met. They turned back when Edmund yawned without apology and leaned his weight against her hip. She adjusted her stride to carry him without making it seem an effort. Alistair watched her, something cracking open in his chest so gently it almost didn't hurt. At the gate, the captain stepped forward and then back again when he saw the look on the prince's face. It said, not in words, that this moment belonged to no one who drew wages. They re-entered the court. The lanterns made a soft road. Edmund's head sank onto Serafina's arm, heavy with sudden sleep. She smiled down at him with an expression that did not resemble anyone so much as herself. In the shadow of the colonnade, they stopped, because it seemed wrong to spend this moment walking. The palace around them waited, always listening, always ready to convert tenderness into rumor. Tonight it felt briefly like a house. He could almost hear laughter that had once lived between these stones and might again, if he did not lose courage. Alistair turned to face her fully. He had not rehearsed this because the true things refuse rehearsal. "I cannot speak to tomorrow," he said, quiet and even. "I cannot promise the court will be kinder because it should be. I cannot promise that my mother will soften. I can promise only this. If you will stay, I will stand between you and every blade that comes for what is yours, not because of whom you resemble, but because of who you are." She held his gaze. The locket was a little moon at her throat. "I have been many things and none," she answered. "Tonight you ask me to be a woman who believes. That terrifies me more than exile." "Then let us be terrified together," he said, a wryness at the edges of his mouth that made him, for a second, the man he had been before grief taught him to speak only in straight lines. Her breath left her on a soft, incredulous laugh. She shifted Edmund gently into his father's arms. The child murmured and settled, trusting the exchange without waking. She freed her hands, not to argue, but to answer. "Stand with me, then," she said, "and I will stand, not as a shadow, not as a debt, but as myself." "I love you," he said. The words were not a flourish. They were a plank laid over a gap so the two of them could cross. He had not meant to speak them today, not here, but the truth had been hard won in this house and had to be used while the courage held. Her eyes shone, not with courtly tears, but with something steadier, recognition that this was not the past begging for resurrection. It was the present asking for a future. "I do not know the language for this," she confessed, voice rough. "But I know the feeling. It is like standing in sunlight for the first time and believing the warmth will not be snatched away." "Then call it by your own name," he said. "Call it what you please. Stay. Build it with me." She reached for his hand. This time neither of them paused at the last breath. Their fingers closed. The fit was simple. It sent quiet out like rings in water. Somewhere, a clock marked the hour. The sound did not feel like time ending, but time beginning to behave. Footsteps approached. The dowager came into view at the far edge of the arcade, her attendants behind her like smaller shadows. She stopped when she saw them. For a long moment, the three stood as points on a triangle drawn by duty and blood and something that refused to be named. The old woman's gaze took in the child asleep in Alistair's arms, the locket at Seraphina's throat, their joined hands. "When truth enters a house," she said at last, voice low and even, "the furniture must be moved." It was not apology. It was not blessing. It was the nearest thing she could give, and it was enough. Alistair inclined his head. He did not gloat. He would not cheapen what had cost so much to say aloud. The dowager turned and went, her cane tapping softly, the rhythm as familiar as rain. They remained in the colonnade a few breaths longer, as if to mark this threshold with their bodies. Then they moved together into the glow of the door. Within the entry, a small thing waited that set itself immediately into memory. The maid who had first brought hot water to Seraphina's room stood with a folded shawl in her hands. She did not bow. She stepped forward and lifted the wool to settle over Seraphina's shoulders with the instinctive care of one woman to another. "For warmth," the maid said, eyes bright but steady. "Thank you," Seraphina replied, a simple phrase that felt like a cornerstone. They climbed the stair, not quickly, not ceremonially, but as a family climbs stairs at the end of a day that will be spoken of for years. At the first landing, Edmund stirred and then slept harder, the way children do when they know the arms carrying them will not fail. Alistair pressed his lips to the boy's hair and thought, without flinching, of another woman whose memory had taught him how to be the man he was now. He felt grief move over for love on the same bench. At Seraphina's chamber door he paused. "Stay here tonight," he said softly, "not because you are confined, but because I wish you to rest without fear. Tomorrow we begin," she finished, and surprised herself with the certainty in it. He handed Edmund to the nurse who had emerged from the shadows. sleep-softened eyes grateful to be reclaimed into purpose. The nurse curtsied and carried the child away. Her steps whisper light. Serafina's hand rose to the locket. She lifted it and looked at the tiny crest. The linework dulled by years and yet shining. "I wandered long," she said. "In my wandering, I never hoped for this." "Neither did I," he admitted. "That is how you know it is real." She smiled. It altered the room's air. "Good night, Alistair." He took her free hand and bent his head, not to her fingers, too formal, but nearer, a breath from her knuckles, a gesture that honored the path she had walked to reach this threshold. When he straightened, their eyes held. "Good night, Serafina," he said. Her name was a promise on his tongue. She stepped into the room and turned back once, a habit born of years of making sure doors closed to keep out weather and harm. The door met the frame with a sound like a satisfied sigh. Alistair stood a moment in the hushed corridor. He placed his palm flat against the wood, feeling warmth seep through from the fire beyond. He did not pray. He simply let relief and devotion and resolve arrange themselves in him without interference. Then he turned and walked toward his son's chamber, a lighter weight in his arms replaced by a steadier weight in his chest. In the morning, the market would wake, the palace would stir, and those who loved the shape of scandal would attempt to bend the story back toward noise. They would fail. Tonight, in the soft brightness of a single corridor, a family had been made visible. At first light, when the bells began to chime, Edmund slipped free of his bed and padded into the hall, hair in sweet disarray, the locket's twin, kept in the treasury and now fetched by careful hands, nestled in a folded cloth he carried with the same care as last night. He knocked at Serafina's door with the seriousness of a messenger bearing a treaty. She opened to him, robe belted, eyes radiant from sleep that had at last come without fear. He held out the cloth, and inside lay the second token, preserved all these years in silence. "It should be together," he said, "because children understand symbols before adults dare to name them." She took the twin piece with a wonder that felt holy. She fitted both to one chain with fingers that had learned dexterity in harder tasks. The twin lockets settled against her pulse, two halves made whole. Alistair appeared at the far end of the corridor, drawn by the sound he had not known he was waiting to hear, his son's voice offering something instead of asking for it. He stopped when he saw them, a woman with light on her face, a boy with pride on his, and the old house holding them without protest. He went to them and did nothing grand. He gathered them both, one under each arm, and for a moment there was no palace, no council, no dowager, no city, only the press and warmth of belonging. He felt Serafina's cheek against his shoulder, the faint tremor of a laugh that had not yet had time to learn itself here. He let his head rest a second against her hair and whispered, low enough that only she could hear, "Stay." "I am here," she answered, and the way she said it made the words mean more than location. It made them a vow. They turned together toward the stair, toward bread, toward the day that would demand all the courage they owned. Alistair took the first step. Serafina matched him. Edmund hopped the last of the landing as children do when they can't contain happiness. The locket on her breast caught the new light and flashed once, as if to tell the house and the city and the watching world. Now, at last, everything begins. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.